Welcome back to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry. And on today's show, we have a returning guest, a guest who has had two separate appearances on the podcast where we spoke about the division of Korea, the Korean War, and I think Cold War diplomacy and the Olympics in South Korea. And this is Kathryn Weathersby. Kathryn is an adjunct professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Studies, adjunct faculty at Korea University, and the co-founder of the Korean War Archives at Korea University. Kathryn, welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Did I get your biography close to accurate there?
Pretty good.
Okay. Well, you are back in Korea at the moment, up in Seoul, and I'm down in Busan. And welcome back, of course. And we are going to speak about some new research of yours. And this is about borderlands, Moscow, Japan, the fear involved in that, and the improvised division of the peninsula. So as a first question, what is a borderland as this place of fear and confrontation in theory?
Well, it's just a place where two countries come together, basic definition of a border. And so the area on either side of that border, this paper was prepared for a conference here in Seoul that was on the last few days on borderlands, looking at Korea in context of other borderlands around the world. Because it's a particular fate of Korea. It's so shaped its history that it is the borderland between China and Japan, between Japan and Mongolia, and then in the more recent times between Japan and Russia, and that's what I'm looking at today.
Well, let's wind back to the beginning, and we will come up to the division of Korea. Back to 1860, when Korea becomes the borderland for Russia.
Right. Well, the Pacific coast is very far away from Moscow, obviously, but the Russian Empire gradually expanded all the way to the Pacific. And then in 1860, got the area to the east of the Ussuri River, so they call it the Ussuri Territory, that extends all the way down to the Tumen, so to the border of Korea. Got it through a treaty with China, and it's interesting the way they persuaded the Chinese throne to give them that land. They wanted it because of the bays, very useful ports along the peninsula, down in that southern part of the coastland. The argument to China was that the British have been surveying those ports, those well-situated bays, the one that became Vladivostok. And so this is bad for China, the British, who were, of course, the great menace of China in the early 19th century. You better cede it to us, or else the British will take it, and that will be much worse for you. In 1860, the British, along with some others, occupied Beijing, right? And so that argument was more persuasive. So Russia did manage to get that territory from China. And one consequence of that is that as they began to think about establishing an important port on the Pacific, it would be the base of their navy. And it, of course, did become that, and it remains that, Vladivostok. They had to be concerned about the border, right? What's next to it, and what is next to Vladivostok, just a few miles from it, is the Korean border. Korea was not a threatening country in the late 19th century. But the problem was that other more powerful and more aggressive countries could get control of Korea. And if they did, then they could put pressure on, they could threaten Russia's hold of those valuable ports. It's just this basic kind of phenomenon we have as people. Once we get something valuable, then we start to worry that we might lose it, right? Somebody might take it from us, So we finally get this beautiful, huge, elaborate house if we're wealthy, and so then we have to build a fence around it and put security cameras, and then if it's valuable enough, we have to hire a private security firm to patrol it. It's the same kind of phenomenon, really.
So was Russia's fear that it'll be taken over by a specific country like China?
Well, yes, it changed. Initially, it was China, because, as they explained, if that happened, then instead of a weak Korea on our border, which is not threatening, we would find, the great power of China. But then when Japan defeated China quite decisively in the War of 1884-85, the focus naturally shifted to Japan. And there was an interesting period of, initially there was a kind of equilibrium over Korea between Russia and Japan, but there was an interesting period of the two balancing each other out, sort of scoping out each other's intentions with regard to the peninsula. As that was going on, Russia increased its presence and strengthened its presence around Korea by moving into Manchuria, using the weakness of China at the time to get agreement to build a branch of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. If you think in your mind of the map of Manchuria, remember how it sticks up into Russia. It really protrudes up into Russia. So the Trans-Siberian Railroad had to go around Manchuria, around that big protrusion, down to Vladivostok, the important port. And so it would be much more efficient, save a lot of time if you could go through Manchuria, through that hump. So they did. That's the Chinese Eastern Railway. They made an agreement with China to build it that way. So you see it on the map going straight across northern Manchuria down to Vladivostok. But then there's another issue with Vladivostok, which is that it's iced in the winter. So, all right, it's going to be our main port. We're going to put a navy there, but that's a problem for it to be iced in for a third of the year. So therefore, they set their eyes on the very well situated ports at the tip of the Liaodong Peninsula in Manchuria, what became called Port Arthur and Dairen, or Dalny in Russian. So they made another agreement with China to build a branch line from the Chinese Eastern Railroad straight south down to those two ports. So now Russia had possession of two ports on either side of Korea. Well, actually three, two on Liaodong and then one in Vladivostok, plus railroads to and connect European Russia with both of those important naval outlets and commercial outlets as well. So as this was happening then, Japan is, of course, developing its imperialist aims, which include Korea. And so there are a series of negotiations with Russia over how they're to balance their goals. It's very interesting, actually, that at one point, let's see exactly when it was, 96, I believe, 1896. So just the year after, a decade after the defeat of China by Japan. Japan proposed to Russia that they divide Korea at the 38th parallel, with the southern half being designated the Japanese sphere and the northern half the Russian sphere. Interesting that that was contemplated that early. However, Russia was not willing to agree to that because another issue with Vladivostok is that, again, looking at the map, to get your ships out to the Pacific from Vladivostok or into Vladivostok, if they're out in the Pacific, you're going to have to go through the Korean Straits, which are relatively narrow. And so the southern tip of Korea was the most important part to Russia, because they had to, secure, egress out into the ocean. They also needed to be sure that ships could go between Vladivostok and those two ports on Liaodong Peninsula. So they didn't want to cede to Japan completely the southern half of Korea, because combined with control of the Japanese home islands, they could block Russian passage through the Korean Straits. Yeah.
How much from your reading here were Russia concerned about a division of Korea? I remember, as I'm reading here, and you write that Japan's initial proposal was to cut Korea in half at the 38th parallel. And earlier on, there was also a point where Russia were fearful of what any power being in the Korean in the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, the idea was that it would be better for Russia if there were a balance of power on the peninsula. So China would have a presence there, Russia would have a presence, Japan would have a presence, the US perhaps, Britain perhaps, but that no one country get complete control of the peninsula, as long as there, is a balance, right? Sort of competing influences on the peninsula, then it's not going to be such a threat to their ports in the region.
What happened during the Boxer Uprising? Because this is interesting. This seems to get Russia and Japan quite animated about the possibility of Chinese involvement in Korea.
Yeah, so they were afraid that the Boxer movement might spread to Korea. And if that happened, both the Japanese and the Russians would send troops, would feel a need to send troops to maintain order on the peninsula. And so, anticipating that might happen, then they started discussions about regulating the amount of military presence they would each have in the peninsula. And so you can see a lot of positioning and a lot of imagining scenarios that would be dangerous to both of them regarding Korea.
There's sorry, Karen.
Yes. No,
please.
Go ahead.
There's a moment here, and you're right in that Tokyo concluded at some point in this, I think it was 1902, that an alliance with Great Britain would be helpful, that effectively isolated Russia in the Far East. And these discussions that run, and Russia reject them, I believe. And you write, with hindsight, such an arrangement would have been advantageous to Russia, and they seem to have missed an opportunity here.
Well, at least on a very simple level, you might look at that situation and say, well, it would have been better for Russia if it had made this kind of agreement with Japan, that Manchuria would be in the Russian zone. That's, after all, where the really significant Russian investment is, the building of the railroads and the ports. That's, and Manchuria has a very big border with Russia. So clearly Manchuria is more important to Russia. And so they could have kind of made a trade with Japan. It wouldn't have lasted for very long, however. As we know, Japan's aspirations were grand, and so they wouldn't have left Manchuria in Russian hands indefinitely. But for a time, at least, it might have avoided a war. But again, St. Petersburg was simply not willing to cede all of Korea for the reasons I mentioned earlier. The southern tip of Korea is so important to guarding the navigational pathways that Russia depended on. So they were never willing to do that. And so as a consequence, there was war between Russia and Japan in 1904. Yeah.
Just before that, though, there's, I think in 1903, Russia do make a proposal to Japan. And I'll get you to explain it, but it involves, again, they brought around to the idea, I think it's a commitment that Japan don't militarize the southern half of the peninsula. I think something about free trade. And also that the 38th parallel becomes a neutral zone.
Yeah. Another interesting proposal. And this time, 1903, the proposal was that the area north of the 39th parallel, so further north, would be a neutral zone, that Japan would agree to that. So that would be the area closest to Russia. And that also the coastal islands that are part of Manchuria would be outside of Japan's sphere of interest. So that was not agreed to either, but you can see that the two were sparring with one another to try to come to some agreement about the peninsula that would satisfy the perceived security needs of both of them.
Well, let's talk about that war and that conflict in 1904, 1905. There's something interesting here. This is Tsar Nicholas. I think it's January 1904. He finally agrees to this deal with Tokyo. Yeah, and he rushes it out, and it's 3 weeks late, I think you're right, and the war goes ahead.
Right. When he finally was persuaded to agree to it, because otherwise Japan was going to attack, it was too late. Yeah. His message was delayed by 2 weeks, in the pre-modern era of communications. Message between St. Petersburg and Tokyo could take a long time. And the Japanese saw it as an insult that they didn't get a response, not knowing that the message had been dispatched, but simply was delayed. And so they made the decision to go ahead and attack Russia.
And how badly did that war go? I know some people may be familiar with it, but it has a huge amount of significance. It's, an Eastern power defeating a Western power. Well, it
was a great shock to the Western world. They simply couldn't believe that any Asian power could defeat them. Part of the reason also that the Russians were not willing to agree to Japan's demands. These racist notions were so strong that they really didn't believe they needed to take the Japanese that seriously. It was not a complete defeat, at least in the eyes of Russia. There were very significant losses on land in the land battles, and then a very famous loss of the Baltic fleet that was sent all the way around to the coast of Korea and was sunk by the Japanese. Nonetheless, despite that, the Russian government did not consider that they were completely defeated by Japan. And so when they went to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, of all places, to negotiate a peace treaty, that seems, a separate story, right? Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a long way from both of them. When they got there, they engaged in very intense bargaining. The negotiations lasted a month for the Treaty of Portsmouth. I think in hindsight, we tend to think this was a great Japanese victory, an absolute Japanese victory. And if that had been the case, then this treaty would have been concluded much more quickly than it was. However, yeah.
No, please.
The reason President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, that is, not Franklin, mediated it was that the U.S. was emerging as a Pacific power. And so, therefore, the U.S. wanted to play a role in working out the kind of balance of power, to use that term again, in the Pacific with the rise of Japan. So that's why the Americans were involved. But what really tipped the scales in Japan's favor was its alliance with Britain, right, which involved Britain agreeing to Japan's rise in Asia, combined with the U.S. not opposing Japan's moves against Korea. And that was done because both of those great powers were engaged in the same kind of horse trading, you might say, that they had done in other parts of the world, right? As the British and French had done, for example, in Africa and in Southeast Asia. So the imperial powers, the great imperialist powers, were trading with each other. All right, we'll take Burma. You can have Indochina, and we'll leave Thailand as a buffer zone between us. Neither of us will take Thailand. Okay, all right, we'll do it that way. It's that. So this is the game that was being played worldwide. So as Japan emerged as a player in that game, it seemed natural to the other participants in that game that they start doing this kind of trading. And the Americans were not interested in Korea. They were interested in the Philippines. They already had the Philippines, had taken it from Spain in 1898. So the Americans were establishing themselves in the southern part of the region. And so
let's talk about what Russia lost there, because I found this part really interesting. You're right that they have to evacuate Manchuria to Chinese control. They give away these ports to Japan. They give away the South Manchurian Railway. And a measure of how much this hurts Russian ideology or pride or whatever it is. You're right, 40 years later, Stalin is being pressed by the Americans to get into the war with Japan. And he demands first compensation, and that Russia and that the then Soviet Union regains that lost territory as a prize.
Exactly. Yeah. The Treaty of Portsmouth remained a terrible, an insult, an injury, in the minds of Russian leaders from 1905 through 1945. Communist ideology, to the side, they were very sensitive to the losses of Russian territory and Russian property in that treaty. Yeah, they lost southern Sakhalin Island, which is just off the coast of Russia above Hokkaido, but also those important railroads and ports. Yeah, and we're determined to get them back. Right.
And apart from those physical losses, this must have been, and as you're right here, devastating to those ideas we're talking about 10 minutes ago, that Russia wanted to maintain a certain balance of power, where they had lost all this initiative and all that grasp there. And you're right that, of course, in 1917, the Tsar abdicates and Russia collapses into civil war, and Japan take advantage of this chaos and move into Siberia.
Yeah, I think this is not much in the public awareness, the Japanese occupation of Siberia. So it's worth pointing that out. The Tsarist government collapsed. Russia collapsed into civil war the following year. And so Japan made use of the weakness of Russia to land troops in Vladivostok and to move them onto the Trans-Siberian Railroad across Siberia. They occupied all of the major cities of Siberia, which are all located along the railroad, and held them for 4 years. That's a long time.
Mm.
So Japan was in occupation of Siberia for 4 years, from 1918 to 1922. They withdrew only under American presence, because American pressure, because at that time the U.S. was beginning a series of naval treaties, naval armament treaties with Japan, trying to, arms control treaties, basically. So that was involved in Japan pulling its troops out in 1922. The Soviet government was created in 1921. And so when it was created, Japanese forces were still in occupation of Siberia. It was only the following year that the new Soviet government, which was a pretty shaky kind of operation, got control of the vast Siberian land. So it remained very afraid of the Japanese. So much so that they expelled all Korean communists who had crossed the border into the Soviet Union seeking refuge from Japanese police after Japan's occupation of Korea. So that seems pretty brutal. This is a new communist government, supposed to be the bulwark of the revolution. But they're so afraid that the Korean communists along that coastline would do something to provoke an attack from Japan that they threw them all out of the country. No.
Do they maintain, I think you wrote a little later, that they still maintain, I think, surreptitious relationships with those communists at some point? And
yes, they did, with the one as best they could with Korean communists who remained in Korea and operated underground. That was difficult to do, but they had a very direct contact with Korean communists who fled to Manchuria, because control of Manchuria was much weaker than of Korea itself. The Comintern continued to direct their activities, and the Korean party, like all other parties, would follow the directives the Comintern gave them. I have a quote here from this period of Comintern direction of the Korean Communist movement. Said that the main hinterland from where Japan can direct its blows, both against the USSR and against China, is Korea. So to the extent that the coming of the Pacific War becomes more imminent, the economic and strategical importance of Korea is increasing. So already, this is the 1920s, they are looking at Korea in terms of its strategic importance vis-a-vis Japan. And this will continue, right, into the 1940s and shape the division and the war as well.
I really hope you're enjoying this episode of the podcast, and I apologize for this interruption, but I'm just going to take this moment to remind our listeners that we've made a conscious decision here in the Korean App podcast not to run advertising in any way. So if you do enjoy the podcast and you listen regularly and you do want it to continue, it is important that you do your best to support us at the links below, or by sharing, liking, or commenting on the podcast across social media. All your help in this regard is invaluable. And now back to the episode. There's a really interesting point. I think it's 1931, and you write that, of course, a lot of these fears that the Soviet Union have are not unfounded, that intelligence reaches Moscow, that Japan is got its eye on the Siberian oil fields and is planning to seize them.
Right. Well, it had learned a lot about Siberia in those 4 years that it occupied it. And Siberia is, of course, extremely rich in oil and gas and mineral resources. So after Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the danger that it would move against the Soviet Union itself seemed much greater. And indeed, Japan was actively considering moving into Siberia, particularly to get the oil that it needed for its war machine. The Soviet Union had good spies in Tokyo. They had good spies many places. Tokyo was one of them. So the Soviet government was well informed about discussions within the Japanese government. So yes, tremendous fear of Japan in the 1930s. Stalin was at the center of this. So he spent a lot of his time worrying about the possibility of a Japanese attack. And then in 1937, skirmishes began along the border. And then in 1939, I should say, before I get to that, let me just point out that these skirmishes along the border prompted Stalin again to take quite extreme action regarding Koreans living in the Soviet Far East. This time it was against Koreans who had moved over into the Ussuri territory much earlier, right? Not Korean communists who had fled Japanese control of Korea, but Koreans that had simply migrated in search of land or business opportunities or whatever. In the late 19th century, there was about just under 200,000 of them. So he was so afraid, again, that they would do something to provoke an attack on the Soviet Union from Japan, that he took the action he took against numerous groups around the Soviet Union in the 30s and the 40s. He loaded them all up on railroad cars and shipped them to Central Asia. It's a very long way from the Ussuri territory all the way down to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, but that's where they went.
And as the war begins to rage, I think this is April 1941, Stalin signs a neutrality pact with Tokyo. And this is an important moment, and it's going to run a little bit further than this because he is desperate, and this runs through to Yalta afterwards. He is desperate not to fight a war on two fronts here.
Right. In 1939, after the deportation of Koreans to Central Asia, Japan finally did attack Russian forces at this place called Nomonhan, the Japanese name for it anyway, on the border, the place where Mongolia and Manchuria and Russia meet. It was a huge battle, lasted several months, and Japan was soundly defeated by the Soviet forces. It had a great impact on Japan. It was a kind of catastrophic loss for them. And so they gave up their plan of taking Siberia and decided instead to move south down toward Indonesia for their oil. But Stalin remained very afraid, as you said. And so as war with Germany became imminent in 1941, he concluded a neutrality pact with Japan to make sure he wouldn't have to fight on both fronts simultaneously. And he was so determined to maintain this neutrality that he refused to even discuss Soviet entry into the war against Japan until the Yalta Conference of February 1945, when Germany was on the verge of defeat. Germany surrendered in May. So by by February, it was clear that Germany was going to surrender quite soon. So it was only at that point that Stalin was even willing to discuss the Pacific War with the Americans and the British. And at that point, he then agreed that he would enter the war in the Pacific within 3 months of the surrender of Germany, which is what he then did do.
And as you write, he has a long list of grievances and territories he wants returned to him during this conference. But he doesn't mention Korea, of course.
Right, because Korea had never been Russian territory. It had been an area they were very concerned about, because if it were under the control of a hostile power, that hostile power could threaten the Soviet coastline down to Vladivostok. But the Russian goal had never been to control the Korean peninsula. That was not, part of their plans. Their approach had always been to just maintain a balance there. So that didn't give a precedent in February of 45 for demanding anything in particular regarding Korea. But when President Roosevelt raised this idea that he had for a trusteeship, a multilateral trusteeship over Korea, that must have seemed, I don't have documentary evidence of this, but just, we can imagine that must have seemed to Stalin like some sort of return to what they had been trying to do pre-1904, international trusteeship, all the countries interested in the peninsula would together supervise affairs, and eventually create a new government. That must not have seemed too undesirable. So he didn't oppose the idea.
And as you write, and I think this probably needs saying, at this point of time, America is very keen to get Russia into this war because they're expecting Tokyo to not surrender and to have to invade house to house.
Right. This is so important, really, in understanding the eventual division of Korea. Again, we need to have a map if all the listeners can picture it.
I will try and link one below the podcast for people.
Good.
Okay.
Because at this late stage of the war, the Americans were advancing island by island from the south, moving up toward the Japanese home islands. Korea and especially Manchuria were completely beyond the reach of the American military. They simply couldn't get there, right, to defeat the very important Japanese forces that were located there. But for the Soviet Union, they could simply move soldiers and weapons across the Trans-Siberian Railroad and come down overland into Manchuria and Korea. So for the military leadership, it was a no-brainer, we might say. Of course, we want the Soviets to move their forces across the Trans-Siberian, come down into Manchuria, and take care of the Japanese forces there. That was a perfectly obvious thing to do. We had been pressing them to do that since the day after Pearl Harbor, actually. We really wanted them to do that. And so at the Potsdam Conference, July and early August of 45, one of the big topics at the Potsdam Conference was the arrangements for the Soviet entry into the war against Japan. And so it was quite uncontroversial. That's what we had been wanting them to do for years. So the military leaders met and agreed that, Manchuria and Korea would be in the Soviet zone of operations. But as you said, we were anticipating that the war would last another year, maybe a year and a half. Anticipated we would have to land forces in Kyushu and fight house to house. And the Japanese resistance on the islands, such as Okinawa and others before Okinawa, had been so ferocious. But to the great surprise of everyone in Washington and Moscow, the combination of the atomic bombs on August 6 and 9 on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with the entrance of 1.5 million Soviet forces on August 9, prompted the government in Tokyo to decide to surrender. They sent a message then to the US that they were planning to surrender. They wanted to surrender to the United States and not the Soviet Union. They were quite adamant about that. They did not want to be occupied by the Soviets. So now suddenly, as soon as the Soviets enter Manchuria and northern Korea, they got into Korea the very first day, the northern part of the peninsula. Now the whole picture changes because the war is about to end. So now, from the American side, we don't really need you so much. Okay, let's rethink this, And in particular, of course, the Soviets weren't thinking this. This was the American, thinking, yikes. And because they wanted to rethink it, particularly because by that time, the Red Army, the Soviet Army, had occupied Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe on their way to Berlin. In the course of defeating the German army, they occupied vast stretches of territory in Eastern Europe, including Poland. And in Poland, this very crucial borderland that is analogous to Korea in its location and in its history,
yes,
as a result of that location. So what the Red Army did in Poland was to set up its own pro-Moscow communist government, quite in violation of agreements they had made with the British and the Americans to hold elections in Poland. And when the Polish government in exile returned from London, the Soviets arrested them and they were never seen again. So this was very worrisome, right, to the Americans. They said, Korea is going to be the Polish situation transplanted to the East. And in fact, it would have been the Poland of the East if the Soviets had occupied the whole peninsula. Well, the Americans didn't want that, not because of concern for the impact on Korean people of being ruled from Moscow, but rather because of the impact on Japan. Right? All eyes are on Japan, but of course they're on Japan, right? Japan had just conducted this massive, absolutely devastating war. So, of course, Japan was the focus of concern for both the Americans and the Soviets. They were worried about what would happen in Japan in the post-war period. The Soviets assumed that Japan would rearm, remilitarize, and again become a threat. The same way they assumed that of Germany. So from Moscow's point of view, the two great concerns were, future Germany, future Japan, assuming they would again become military threats.
So here's the tricky question, and you mentioned it in your paper, actually, and this is really interesting. And you're right, there's unfortunately no archival documents to explain Stalin's decision here. He's so fearful of Japan becoming a threat again to the Soviet Union. Why does he agree to a revision of Potsdam? Why does he so happily agree to divide Korea and to renounce all claims?
It's a good question. And again, we don't have firm documentary evidence. The best I could do was to piece together everything we do know about what was happening. Because of American concern that Soviet-occupied Korea would put too much pressure on Japan, would strengthen the Japanese Communist Party, would make it more likely that Japan would end up in the Soviet sphere in the post-war world with its war-making capacity added to the Soviet side. We really, really did not want that to happen. And therefore, political leadership in Washington proposed that we send some American forces to occupy at least a portion of southern Korea. So in MacArthur's General Order Number 1, issued to govern the surrender of Japanese forces, there was one point out of scores of points providing that Korea would be divided at the 38th parallel. It was just a convenient line on the map and would keep Seoul in the American zone. So we said, use the 38th parallel. So that was to be the border. And so that was included in MacArthur's General Order Number 1, which was sent to Moscow by telegram. And the draft form of it was, he wrote back with 2 requested changes, one having to do with the Kurils. He wanted all of the Kurils down to Hokkaido, the issue that still is a serious issue between Japan and Russia. And he wanted an occupation zone in Hokkaido. Because Stalin is wanting to make sure that the post-war Japan would not be, a threat to the Soviet Union. So he wanted a strong Soviet presence there, some ability to thwart American intentions, some future Japanese intentions, whatever. So he didn't say anything about the American request to have an occupation zone in the south of Korea. He could very easily have said, no, we made an agreement 2 weeks ago that Korea was in the Soviet zone. That's you can't change it at this point. That seems to me like would have been easy to do, but he didn't do that. And I think it's because there was a big chessboard, not only in the Pacific, but also in Europe and in the Near East. The 3 victorious powers coming out of the war were making arrangements for territories liberated from the enemy in all of those areas, North Africa to the Middle East, to Europe, to Southeast Asia, to East Asia. And it was a gigantic process happening. And so naturally they were trading and they were making deals, right? Keeping in mind their top priorities. So for the Soviet Union, the top priority was Japan. And so if they agree to this request from the Americans regarding Korea, then that gives them, a little bit of negotiating leverage to use against the Americans vis-a-vis Japan. So I think that's why they agreed to it. They were putting all their focus in that part of the world on trying to get protection from post-war Japan. Yeah.
There is a moment, you write, that in the fall of 1945, Stalin continues to push for a greater role in the occupation of Japan.
Right.
And it sounds like this, you don't explicitly say it, but it sounds like this in your writing, that in a way, Stalin almost holds Korea hostage. There's a division, there's acute food crises and fuel crises, and he won't talk about any of that until he gets his way with Japan.
Yeah, I think it was not so much holding it hostage. I can see that, it might appear that way, but it wasn't so much that as that to make any kind of agreement on these practical problems of electricity supply and food and all sorts of things that arose from the division into two occupation zones would prejudice a future agreement, And therefore, he just didn't even want to deal with the Korean issue at all until he got as much as he possibly could get vis-a-vis Japan. He didn't want it to interfere with negotiations over Japan. And so that's what happened. They were, the Soviet authorities in the North were ordered to simply refuse to even meet with the American Occupation Command to talk about, practical issues. They wouldn't even meet until finally the Japan issue was resolved in November. The Soviets were forced to accept that the Americans really were not going to back down. The US was ferociously determined to maintain complete control over Japan. And they were very consistent about that. And finally, the Soviets gave up over getting some veto power over occupation policy. So that was in late November when they finally did. So now that issue is over, and now they can turn their attention to Korea.
And this, of course, leads us into the continued division of Korea. And
Right.
Of course, there's actually a really interesting quote here. I think it's from the Soviet Foreign Ministry. And it's talking about, of course, the need to, there's a lot of discussion this time about unifying the government of Korea. But of course, Soviet Union desperately wants this buffer zone. And this is the quote from the conference. If Soviet policy is directed at the destruction of the military capability of the Japanese aggressors, at the eradication of Japanese influence in Korea, at the encouragement of the democratic movement of the Korean people and preparing them for independence, then judging by the activity of the Americans in Korea, American policy has precisely the opposite goal.
Right. Yeah, because the Americans were not being so punitive toward the Japanese in Korea. They were leaving some of them in place just for practical reasons. They knew how to run things. They also left in place the Japanese police force that was staffed by Koreans. They also were not being very punitive to Japan in Japan itself, which was arousing suspicions in Moscow's thinking. It looks like America is aligning with Japan. Yeah. The nature of the government in Korea now is going to become very important for Soviet security. And they can't trust the Americans to create a sufficiently, anti-Japan government in Korea. Right.
And let's step a slightly bit forward in this then and go to the discussions, the high-level discussions between Secretary of State Burns and Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. And you write, this is interesting, thanks to inept and inattentive negotiating by Burns, he loses to Molotov here in a way. You write that that the Soviets are allowed to preserve a certain appearance of cooperation, while at the same time putting a lot of the blockades and stops in place.
Yeah, it was tricky for the Soviets because they needed to maintain the appearance of cooperating with the United States. This is December of 1945, because that soon after the end of the war, they were still working together with the Americans on all kinds of territorial issues around the world, most importantly, Germany. All right, Germany was divided among all four of the Allies, so that was an intense concern of Moscow, cooperating with the Americans to shape and the British as well, to shape a future Germany that would not be a threat. But also the Soviets hoped for economic assistance from the United States to rebuild the Soviet Union after the war. Didn't happen, but of course it happened in Western Europe. So at that time, the Cold War hadn't openly begun. The Soviets were still trying to preserve some kind of cooperation with Moscow. So how do we do, with the Washington, sorry. So how do we do that, but prevent the establishment of a government in Korea that would pose a security threat, which is to say a government that would allow the Japanese or Japan and the US combined to use Korea as a springboard for attack on the Soviet Union? How do we do both of those things? The Soviet negotiators were quite skillful, much more so than the Americans. Secretary of State Burns was not interested in the Korean question. He wanted some kind of agreement for domestic political purposes. Harry Truman was in trouble politically at that time, just a lot of dissatisfaction with various aspects of his administration. And so Burns felt he needed to get some kind of agreement, right, in Korea. Didn't much matter to him what the agreement was, just some agreement to show to the newspapers as an accomplishment, to boost the political standing of his administration. So Moscow outmaneuvered the Americans just absolutely in these negotiations. So they ended up creating this blueprint for trusteeship that would be easy for them to manipulate. So there would be a joint Soviet-American commission, just a two-sided commission, which would give the Soviets veto power, that would consult with Korean political parties and social organizations, that's a Soviet set phrase, to create a provisional government for Korea that would then later hold elections for a permanent government. Okay, looking at that from a distance, right, from an American newspaper, right, for example, that sounds okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all right. That sounds sort of reasonable, and would have been okay if the two parties had been, say, the British and the Americans. They could have worked together to, carry out this process and hold elections and create a new government. Yeah, but of course it was not the British and the Americans; it was the Soviets and the Americans. And their goals for Korea were mutually exclusive. Right? Yeah.
Well, let's jump forward. January 1946.
Yeah.
And they have this, of course, as you said, this joint commission and this provisional government. And in 1946, Koreans in the South take to the streets in mass protest. And the Soviets in the North tell their communist brothers in the South to go out and support the agreement. And they become the only group to do so. And then they use this support to try and exclude all other groups from a say in the democratic process.
Yeah. I like to talk about this to my students and say, okay, what do you think about this trick? Seems like kind of a cheap trick, right? And I get these looks on their faces like, yeah, that's a cheap trick. Yeah, but it worked in a sense. So the Korean Communist Party and its affiliates followed their instructions, although it diminished their standing among the Korean population, to support the trusteeship agreement. But they did, and so they were the only ones who did support the trusteeship agreement. So then, when the Joint Commission met in March of 46, the Soviets could, puff themselves up and say very solemnly and properly, of course, we can only consult with political parties that support the agreement we properly reached in Moscow in December. Of course, that stands to reason. No one could question. Yeah, it's a cheap trick. And so the Americans naturally said, that's ridiculous. And the Soviets said, no, this is proper. And Americans, no, that's ridiculous. And so as we all know, the Joint Commission then finally just stopped meeting in May. In the meantime, the Soviets took steps quite, energetically to secure a tractable government in the north. So they put in place a kind of proto-state in the north, headed by Kim Il-sung, and made sure that at least the northern half of Korea would be a buffer against a future attack from Japan.
Let's have a brief moment to conclude and look back, as you do as well in your paper. And the first thing is you talk about patterns here, and whether it is Britain to China to Japan to the US and Japan, the pattern from the Russian side is fear and security fear.
Right. And we see just really how deep this pattern is. This is the reason I began with 1860. That's a long period of being worried about Japan. So that pattern is very, very strong. We see the emergence right now of this notion on the part of Putin's people that Russia is threatened by an independent Ukraine that is friendly to Western Europe. Ukraine is not in the least bit a threat to Russia. But it appears that way in Putin's mind. So,
Well, from that, as a last question, and it's the last point in your paper as well, which is talking about transitions to peace. And you write, if you look back to the long history of this thing, going back hundreds of years, border disputes in these borderland regions, they really only abate when a larger security zone begins to take over, and it all happens within that zone. So I might get you as a last question to explain that with the hopefully a look where there's a prospect for future peace in these borderlands.
Yeah, well, for centuries, the border between Germany and France, for example, to use one of many we could think of, was a scene of constant fighting. That ended in the post-World War II period when both of them became part of NATO. Both of them became part of unified Western Europe, Western Central Europe. So now, the idea that the French-German border would be a focus of conflict is kind of ridiculous, right? It's a sort of happy thing to look at that and see the effect of the creation of a large security zone that can just dissolve such even really deep-seated patterns of conflict along the border. In Northeast Asia, we don't see any prospect of that, of course, right now, just the opposite. But I just offer the very, modest goal that as we look at the possibility for how this border area can transition to away from the focus of conflict, we at least need to start with understanding the patterns that are there. And we can do that. We can look closely at them and understand exactly what we're dealing with here.
That is a good note to end things on as well. I'm going to link the previous podcasts that I've done with Kathryn below, and people that are interested, I do encourage you to go and listen to them. And I think I'll also link places where you can go and find some of Kathryn's work online. Kathryn Weathersby, it's always such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.